Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we got a new solo album review. We're finally going to be talking about the newest project from Paramore, This Is Why. I think it's well known by now that Paramore has never really clicked all the way there for me, and this would be where I would normally dump out all my disclaimers, just like I did in my last couple Paramore reviews, especially as the band has cemented their place coming out of the 2000s pop rock canon, but I don't really want to do that anymore. Hayley Williams is an expressive frontwoman, and the band can string together some catchy, emotionally evocative tunes, we all know this, but I've also always found them a little bit underwhelming in composition and production, and a little bit underwritten with as many awkward missteps as slam dunks, of which I would also apply to Hayley Williams' solo output the past couple of years. That does not make for a bad band, painting in strokes that are specific emotionally but broad in their poetry with a lot of presence behind the mic. That's gonna give you popular staying power, especially in rock, but they've never really gripped me as much as I would like outside of isolated moments, maybe Riot as their best album, which is why I had a lot of skepticism about This Is Why, where the marketing has been Paramore goes post-punk, especially referencing the 2000s era revival, of which Paramore were actually contemporaneous. Now on the surface, it seems like a natural progression, growing up, getting more thoughtful, mature, complex, and Paramore actually have the major advantage of having really good pop compositional instincts. But it also felt like it could become high risk, high reward, leaning into a subgenre that prides itself on thorny complexity and wry disaffection on one hand, or a much heavier, aggressive, noisier, abrasive sound on the other. The pop pivot of After Laughter, that seemed to fit a lot closer to Paramore's wheelhouse, even if I didn't personally really care much for it. And bringing back producer Carlos de la Garza, who worked on that album and Hayley Williams' solo albums, it felt a little questionable for me, especially as he works way more in indie pop rock than his post-punk, judging by his credits. I mean, thus far we've seen a polarized response outside of the mainstream critical acclaim, so I wanted to give this some time to sink in. So how is This Is Why? Ugh. So here's the utterly exasperating thing with this album. As much as I was skeptical about the post-punk swerve that borrows liberally from Talking Heads, Gang of Four, Block Party, Interpol, probably a dozen other indie post-punk acts the past decade out of the UK, I can see the world in which this album works. As I said, Paramore's got solid pop instincts, a lot of presence, a shot of energy that could be welcome to a genre that's got a reputation for going up its own ass. And yeah, some of that is here, but this is also a lateral move, and one that's absolutely pushing against Paramore's strengths as a band. Yeah, new frontier for them, probably the most openly ambitious project they've ever attempted, and if this is your new intro to a cool new sound, I can respect that, but I've been covering post-punk for around a decade now, and it's not just that I find this aggressively middle-of-the-road at best within the genre, and where the influences are blatantly obvious, it's also not hard to spot where This Is Why comes up short. At least for me. And it's worth starting with my thinking that not all this is Paramore's fault, because compositionally, this album seems to be hitting the mark of Paramore making post-punk. The guitar lines are more jagged and complex. The bass grooves have more nervy energy and presence in the mix than ever before, even if you can tell that the session work is more for utility than flair. And the compositions swerve into some wonkier chord progressions. I'm kinda iffier on the drum work. Sometimes there's some sharper precision, more complex progressions to match the more developed grooves, but Zach Farrow's playing often feels weirdly muffled across a lot of this album, especially with the snare. But that's likely due to the factor that I expected would be a big issue right from the start. I called it. Carlos de la Garza's production just feels off with post-punk. There's no crackle, no dryness to the mix. The guitars spark, but they never seethe or explode. Hayley Williams' vocals, be they messier shouts or a disaffected sneer, they're never positioned well to command anything, and the dynamics just feel weirdly flat, not helped by all the gauzy synths that slip in every so often and add nothing. It's desaturated, sure, but it doesn't really accentuate any tightness or firepower like you would expect in post-punk, or if it does, it becomes very obvious where Paramore is cribbing their notes. I mean, Block Party is a very obvious one, but this isn't Silent Alarm or even Intimacy or Four. The explosive tension never manifests, and when you remember that Paramore's greatest strength comes in their emotionally charged hooks, I mean, it's no surprise the fans are gravitating to the back half, the more mid-tempo cuts and familiar-feeling ballads define that resonance. And speaking of which, despite running just over 30 minutes, this is an album that flags in momentum hard. And while After Laughter had a couple similar moments, that album was surrounded by a lot of flash and considerably better hooks that accentuated Hayley Williams' depression and juxtaposition, whereas this does not have that gloss or artifice, especially by the end where the cuts are a lot more reminiscent of the sleepy Hayley Williams solo albums, which I did not find all that interesting. Now, that's not saying that there aren't moments I like. The title track gets kind of to some of that old school nervy paranoia that Hayley Williams can share. The News has some sandy frustration that infuses some mid-period parquet quartz. And while C'est Comme Ça is probably the most flagrant pull to make a new psycho killer I've heard in a long-ass time, it is pulling from tones that I'm inclined to like, and the juxtaposition between flat disaffection and a snide kiss-off on the hook, it leads to one of the more annoyingly effective hooks on the album. But that's kind of at the roots of the weird hollowness I feel with this. When it's being framed as this big, bold innovation and the best moments feel so obvious in their inspirations, it doesn't feel remotely fresh, and the missteps are all the more glaring. The honking guitar tone and off-key synths on You First are an attempt at dance punk that feels really sour and underpowered, and the fluttery elegance of Big Man, Little Dignity and Figure Eight, they remind me way more of the Arctic Monkeys than they should. And you know what, I'll just say it, I don't think Hayley Williams is a great fit for this sound. She can get some notes of emotional complexity when she's anchored in earnest love or rage or sadness or despair, but self-effacing snark when the stakes don't feel emotionally grounded, or flattened irony that deflects from the rage, that requires a different energy or poise than I think she has. And let's be real, this has kind of been an issue with Paramore since at least the self-titled album and Ain't It Fun, a song a decade later that I still don't think works that well, and hell, that wasn't even post-punk. But that might as well take us to the writing, and where I think this album really stumbles the hardest, because you can tell the band is trying to do what they think that they're supposed to do. Like it or not, post-punk's often thorny and wordy and wildly overeducated. Not smarter, I want to make that abundantly clear, but they're at least trying to present themselves like they want to be. And that's where the very obvious influences really hurt Paramore again, because, to be blunt, this is not a style of writing they do that well. Take The News, which is full of a lot of oversaturated fear and helplessness at the state of the modern world and mainstream media, but then it stops there. There's no deeper examination of how those factors beyond how they impact Hayley Williams. A lot more thin rhetoric and buzzwords than actual substance. C'est Comme Ça could have been a sharp example of the knife's edge we walk between boring but healing self-care and the self-destructive chaos that really is just way too expensive to live that well. But the next step outside of Williams' personal sphere, it doesn't materialize. And you know what? That could work. Personal, relatable experiences as a critique of the system, but I never feel like we get that added step. Hell, This Is Why gets into a lot of polarization and paranoia at the world that's set to pick her apart, something I would normally relate to pretty hard given my platform, but it feels like the defensive first draft of something that's not going to go deeper beyond herself. And those are the songs I like. Big Man, Little Dignity would be fine as your stock critique of male privilege without that weird defeatist streak on the bridge, and it's not the first that wants to give in to some of those darker impulses like You First, which has the feel of avoiding evil a lot more than choosing good, with the hope that eventually karma does the dirty work. Or how Running Out of the Time has that same guess I'm a fuck up mentality that persisted into the go nowhere bad relationship cycle of Figure Eight. And yes, Hayley Williams tries to own it on songs like Liar, admitting the love for her bandmate Taylor York after lying to herself for so long. Or how Thick Skull tries to own all of those toxic narratives that have been spread about her and Paramore for years, and also kind of misses that next step of actually moving on in the song. I don't know, when Taylor Swift was able to own her own messy complexity, it amplified her power, whereas for Hayley Williams, she seems to shrink, with the moral framing never quite getting out of her own head, allowing for more complexity. I mean, I've had this issue with her solo material as well for the past couple of years. I'm not going to be wowed by style alone. especially when I've heard so much of it written better. But maybe that's an unfair expectation. The sort of complex moral ambiguity can shade some emotions in performance, but isn't going to show up in Paramore's writing. Why the hell would I expect it here beyond any conventions of genre? Well, that gets to the question of what anyone still wants from Paramore in 2023. As not much of a fan, I am not the person to answer that question. But I do think they tried to grow up with this album, again, do what they think that they're supposed to do, and it doesn't fit them well. And I get not wanting to be a nostalgia band, but their artistic descendants are expanding the sound of pop punk and emo that Paramore helped lay down in the mid-2000s. They could have been part of that. And hell, even After Laughter worked better than this, going pop. I don't know. I think it's very telling that the most Paramore-esque song on the album is Crave, which is all about loving, or at least accepting, nostalgia. In my opinion, it would have been a much stronger closer than Thick Skull. And it actually really did bother me when Hayley Williams purposefully distanced herself from Misery Business a couple of years ago. Even if, as an artist myself, I get why you might want to walk away from your art when it ages problematically. But come on, not only is it one of their best songs, I think there's an ugly emotional truth to the melodrama that would have been made more interesting by examining it or embracing it, especially with that feminist critique. This is why it still has some of that tentative feel, or it doesn't have the teeth to wade into more potent and complex territory, even if stylistically it implies that it will. And yeah, I know, I'm coming off real harsh in this review. On stylism and composition alone, I do not think this is bad. Paramore don't have a bad album in their catalog, and maybe it works as a gateway album, even if the reality is that very few are going to go check out Silverbacks or Fontaines DC or Television or Parquet Quartz or even the Talking Heads based off of this. But I think Paramore are getting a big pass based on the post-punk pivot by some critics, and if you dig deeper, I don't think you're going to find that much. Call it hit or miss for me. If you want to know why this review is as late as it is, given the backlash likely coming, well, this is why. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I get that this solo review is going to be kind of polarized. I've got more solo reviews planned. I got a backlog that got real thick and fat, but if you've got dissent, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in helping support the channel, beyond buying my merch, links down there, or hell, you just want to get albums on my schedule or argue with me more directly on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but hey, options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.